Okay, students, welcome to week 4 of political sociology. And this week we're talking about labor and politics. And as it just turns out, just coincidentally, today is Monday. It is Labor Day. And think about the extent to which anyone on this day at all thinks about, is concerned with, celebrates labor, workers, unions. No one gives a shit about any of that. Let's face it. Political power of labor is extremely weak. Labor is almost a political non-entity in the United States. People on Labor Day, what do they think? They think, well, I'll go to the beach, I'll visit with friends, social distancing, don't forget those masks. We'll have a barbecue, we'll eat hot dogs, we'll drink beer. Now, these are all wonderful things. I have no objection to any of them, but this is called Labor Day, right? And there's virtually no recognition among the larger popular culture of what that means. Let me do one thing. Okay, it was distracting me. So, I want you to appreciate something that almost all students in almost every class I've ever taught, woefully ignorant about the role of labor unions, labor history, what labor unions contribute, their role politically in the United States. Virtually no knowledge of this. It must be stripped from any kind of education you get. And it is really, I'd have to say, a great loss to the intellectual energy of Americans to not understand the role of unions, the history of labor struggle in the United States as it is. And I would even say that the demise of labor unions, the absence of labor unions, as any kind of significant political economic force in the United States, is responsible to a large extent for the current political landscape that we see in the United States. We talked about neoliberalism, talk a little more about that briefly. Had we had strong labor unions, there would have been more mobilization, there would have been more political participation, there would have been more class consciousness, there would have been efforts to resist and oppose the efforts by the capitalist class to squeeze workers. Unions have been very weak, they've been beaten down. Had they been strengthened, had they been strong, you would have had a different level of political participation, political consciousness. There would have been less economic inequality, and many of the conditions which have brought us to the current Trumpian moment would not have existed. So, again, I encourage you always connect the dots, make the connections. It is vital. And that's why this is an important segment of the class. And I try to introduce something about labor in all my classes. Just coincidentally is Labor Day, and we're starting this week. Please read the articles carefully. They're important. They will fill in some things that I'm not going to discuss here, particularly the factors and reasons that translate union membership into political action, political participation, voting, turnout, knowledge, awareness. Those things are generated within organizational environments. And when you get rid of those organizational environments that people would find themselves in, if they were members of a union. You eliminate the mechanisms by which people are educated and mobilized. Okay, I feel very strongly about this. I get very irritated with the current state, American politics, and I view the situation regarding unions as a significant part of that. Okay, we did talk about the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s. Let me move my screen. I don't know if this bothers you, but it bothers me. Okay. I did mention, and I think I did have this quote by David Harvey, that neoliberalism represented a new class war. And a big part of that war, as I indicated, was a war against labor unions. And I want you to realize that they have been very, very successful. So the new class war, and they have essentially been victorious. Let's take a look at the current situation. Now, during the neoliberal period, just so we understand how labor got into its weak position, I'm going to show you the percentage of labor force that's unionized. And we'll talk about some of these things in more detail as we go along. Union busting, that is actually literally going after unions and either decertifying them, removing them from the workplace, or making it more difficult for workers to join. Capital mobility, where you move jobs from one place where unions are strong to a place where unions are weak or non-existent. And you use the threat of capital mobility to extract concessions from unions. We've had a long period of cuts in hourly wages, givebacks, concessions, not only in wages, but also in benefits and in pensions. And deregulation is a big part of the neoliberal model. So again, what I'm trying to point out here is that we have class conflict. Neoliberalism is a form of class conflict. These are some of the strategies, the tactics that have been used. Deregulation as a broad, general desire of the capitalist class to reduce any kind of regulations that would increase costs on them. But many of those deregulations, or many of the regulations that have been removed, were designed to protect workers. And people, largely in the United States, if you ask them, is deregulation is good because government regulations are bad. The level of indoctrination under neoliberalism is profound, and we need to understand what the consequences of this have been. So, and this is only since 1983, we had our peak levels of unionization, certainly in the private sector, in the early 1970s. So you can see that there's been a steady decline in the private sector unionization. By the way, the majority of people work in the private sector. Okay, but there is a sector where unionization has actually been relatively successful, and that is the public sector, right? Where there's 30 to 40% of public sector workers represented by unions. But if you take them together as a percentage of the labor force, you see that in 2019, 10.3% of the U.S. labor force was represented by a union. 10.3%. That's the lowest level since probably the 1920s, 1930s. Every year they report, this is sometimes called the labor union density. It's called union density. That is the percentage of workers represented by a union. Every year they report this, and every year they say union density is at a record low. Right, 2015, it's at a record low. 2016, it's at a record low. 2017, it's at a record. It's been at a record every year. You understand what I'm saying? Fewer and fewer workers in the labor market toiling in organizations, in enterprises, in workplaces, in factories are represented in any way by an organization, by a labor union. Well, you might say, well, that's just the way it is because, labor unions have become obsolete and, maybe they were needed at one time, but they aren't needed now. That's an utterly false and, frankly, idiotic argument. In fact, if you look at the working conditions today, and given everything we know about inequality and the rollback, unions are actually needed more than ever. And the surveys are showing, because they do surveys on whether people would be willing to support a labor union in their workplace, and support for labor unions has increased significantly. The problem is, how can you translate the desire to be in a labor union or have a labor union representing you at your workplace into actually forming that union? Not an easy thing to do in the United States. It's made deliberately difficult, right? This chart shows you where we stand among the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. This is a group of countries we typically compare ourselves to. They're sort of the industrialized countries of the world. Remember, the OECD, many of them are, electoral democracies, etc. And you can see that we are almost dead last. We're only ahead of Korea, Colombia, Mexico, and Chile. Right. And you can see these other countries have high levels of unionization, some of them in the 80 and 90%. Okay. What are the consequences of that? Does it matter? Why are we exceptional? This is another example of American exceptionalism, and not in a good way. Because this has enormous consequences. And that's what I want you to understand. The significance of having virtually no one, only 10% basically, of the labor force represented by a labor union. And there's all kinds of studies, enormous amounts of data showing the relationship. This is cross-national data. Okay, each one of those little points in this graph are countries, as you can see. And where you have collective bargaining, you're less likely to have less poverty. As I said, union membership has enormous implications economically and politically. And I could put up, and I am going to put up a lot of these charts. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. You can look at them. I just want to drive home the point. What is the significance? Does it matter that workers are represented by labor unions? You can see the United States here, okay? Pretty far down. And we have high levels of poverty. And the pattern is pretty clear, the relationship between them. So if I asked you, this is a question I like to ask students, what is the hypothesis? What is the hypothesis that is proven, validated, supported by this graph? The hypothesis would be the greater the level of collective bargaining coverage, the lower the level of poverty in that nation. All right? So that's one way for you to think about how to formulate your interpretation of these graphs. What do unions do? Well, I could spend a lot of time talking about this. In fact, I wouldn't mind teaching a course at some of the sociology of labor, sociology of work. I guess I could expand this area. So I'm going to keep this fairly concise. There's a history of class conflict and conflict between workers and managers in the United States historically. And some of that was literally confrontations, physical confrontations, violent battles between workers and the representatives of the capitalist class, or the representatives of the owners, or the police, who do not usually protect workers. They usually protect property and the capitalists. Um, so we have in the United States all forms of class conflict. I just showed you a slide that showed you some of the tactics the capitalist class uses in we live in a capitalist society. There's constant, ongoing forms of class conflict. That should be clear, okay? Now, we talk about institutionalized class conflict. What institutionalized means is that there's sort of a regular, formal, bureaucratic way to resolve the conflict between workers and managers, between the owners and the workers in an enterprise, in an industry, in a particular corporation. And we call this collective bargaining and collective bargaining agreements. Right? So workers are a member of a union. They have union leaders. The union leaders have conversations with their workers. What are the issues? Economically, working conditions, benefits, pensions, work rules, etc. They sit down with the representatives of the capitalist class, the managers, and they say, these are the demands we'd like to make. The managers say, well, we can't give you that. How about this? And they go back and back and forth. This is called collective bargaining. Now it's collective. That's key. It's collective because the union is representing all of the workers. Okay, this isn't where one worker goes to their supervisor to try to argue for something for them personally. That's what they want workers to do. Workers are much more powerful, obviously, when they're organized collectively. Remember that fist emerging out of the ground and all the workers swarming around the bottom of that collective organization. Okay. So collective bargaining agreement. And it's hammered out. And eventually they come to some agreement, hopefully. Sometimes there's an impasse. They can't agree. There's no compromise. There might be a walkout. There might be a strike. There might be a wildcat strike. That is, workers might walk out even though the union tells them not to. So there's a lot of aspects to this process, but ultimately, ideally, I guess, in the end, you come to some agreement. Labor compromises on a few things, and they gain some things. Same thing for management, and they sit down and they sign the collective bargaining agreement, which essentially determines the conditions and terms of employment for the workers over the period of the contract. Could be 3, 4, 5 years. Okay? And then they sit down and sign it. That's what these guys are doing. I always ask students, I say, which one is the labor guy and which one is the management guy? Is there any way you can tell just by the way they're dressed? Maybe not, This is called business unionism to some extent. This is not radical. This isn't workers' control, okay? This isn't anything radical. But this is what typically is meant by being represented by a union in the workplace and then ensuring that your interests, to some extent, are represented. If you don't have a union representing you, and most of you are going to work in places don't have a union, you have no collective bargaining rights. Your desires don't really matter, okay? There is no opportunity to collectively take action unless you want to walk out, okay, and demand something. And that may be happening more and more often under current conditions. So a collective bargaining agreement, remember, this applies to all workers. All workers are covered by the collective bargaining agreement automatically. And that's an important point I want to get to. Okay, somebody wrote this wonderful article from brass knuckles to briefcases. And I love the title because it essentially describes the way in which owners, the capitalist class, have historically tried to remove or eliminate or discourage unions from organizing in their workplace. If you're a capitalist, it's only rational, okay? Within the context of capital, it's only rational that you really do not want your workers to organize. Because if they organize, not only will they make more money, but they will also dictate some of the conditions of employment, scheduling, terms, benefits, and you develop within the working population at your company a level of class awareness. You don't want that. So you want to eliminate unions. You don't want them to make any headway. And at one time, what did you do when you heard that there were some people talking union in your organization? Workers talking to each other about forming a union. What did you do? Back in, the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, through the 1920s, you hired the goon squad. You hired the thugs, okay? Company goons. What did they do? They beat the shit out of the people who were trying to organize a union. Brass knuckles. You know what brass knuckles are? No one uses them anymore because everyone's armed, right? So they can just blow people away with a gun. There was a time when, you actually used your fist, right? But you didn't want to, if you want to do a lot of damage, put some brass knuckles on, right? So they would just beat up union organizers. This was not uncommon. This was very, very routine. It's a form of class conflict. But over time, they became a little more sophisticated. And now what they do is they hire law firms. There are law firms that specialize in nothing but consulting private enterprises on how to circumvent unions, how to make it less likely they will emerge within your organization, how to prevent them legally from forming in your workplace because you do not want unions. Okay? And for those of you, and I think I mentioned this before, who maybe have worked in some of these large retail stores, in your orientation, they will tell you why unions are bad, horrible. You don't want to have anything to do with them. If you have a problem, just, ask your supervisor. They want to deal with you individually. They never want to deal with the workers collectively because collective power is so much stronger and has so much more leverage. So this is Jackson Lewis. Okay, it's a law firm. It's one of the more notorious union busting law firms that exist in the country. They're all over the United States. They have a office here in Jacksonville. So for those of you who want to get into the union busting law field, there you go. Or if you don't like union busting law firms, you can go knock on their door and tell them how upset you are with what they're doing. I'm sure they'll give you an audience. This came out recently, just so you understand that busting unions is a lucrative business. U.S. employers spent $340 million a year. And let's see, this was in December 2019. Okay, less than a year ago, busting unions. Now they spend this money hiring law firms to give them advice, strategies, tactics to make it hard for workers to form together to exercise some level of democratic rights at the workplace. That's what I call democratic rights. We can talk about theories of democracy later, and you'll see how that works into this conception of what democracy is. We think of democracy as, let's have elections. There's something called economic democracy, workplace democracy. In the United States, we have virtually no workplace democracy at all. Workplaces are little dictatorships for the most part, totally undemocratic, often very authoritarian. It turns out U.S. employers are charged with violating federal law in 41.5% of all union election campaigns. So even when the workers finally are able to have an election to determine whether a union will represent them, employers use tactics which are a violation of law. The National Labor Relations Board is supposed to be monitoring these things, but increasingly you have people put on the National Labor Relations Board who themselves are anti-union. This is sort of the typical way in which agencies and organizations of the U.S. government have been staffed recently. Right? It's called regulatory capture. The people who oppose what the agencies do actually capture those agencies to ensure that those agencies don't carry out their mandate. For example, environmental protection, right? You put somebody to head the Environmental Protection Agency and to staff that basically are opposed to environmental regulations. Or you put people in charge of the National Labor Relations Board, people who essentially are opposed to seeing an expansion of labor unions. I know it doesn't seem to make much sense, but that is what we call regulatory capture in the United States. There is a link there to this, to a study that provides that 41.5% figure underneath the text. So we know that unionization rates are highly correlated with other aspects of economic life in the United States. Here's a graph showing the percent of workers that are in a union and the decrease in the income of the middle class. I think you can state the hypothesis that is supported by this graph. I hope you can, right? I would say that these two things are moving together very, very closely. They're obviously highly correlated. Correlation is not always the same as causation, but there clearly is some logical pattern here in terms of people being represented on the job by a union that negotiates for their wages and salaries and middle class incomes. And when those organizations disappear, it's likely that so will the income and salaries that we might define as middle class. Very powerful, powerful graph. Here's another one, and this is a beautiful graph because it shows the relationship between inequality and a percent of the labor force represented by a union. The red line is inequality. So let's just think of that as the higher that is on the vertical axis, the y-axis. The higher that line is, the greater the inequality. The lower that line is, the lower the inequality. The blue line, the higher, the greater the unionization. The lower that line, the lower the unionization. Right? So you can see, starting in 1918, we had very, very low levels of unionization. This was before the Great Depression, before we had the National Labor Relations Board. So there were very, very few unions even allowed by law to represent workers. And we had the highest levels of inequality at any point in American history. At that time, the Gilded Age, the 1920s, high levels of inequality. Then we had the National Labor Relations Board. We had an increase in union representation. You can see the blue line going up. And then you have that period, the sort of labor capital accord period, right, where the two lines are pretty close together, charting close together from, let's say, 1942 through, let's say, roughly maybe 1974. Then you see a divergence. You see the attack on unions under neoliberalism. Union representation declines. That's the blue line. And the red line, that's inequality goes up. And as I've told you many times, we have today the highest level of income and wealth inequality since we have been keeping track of these things. And you can see it's higher than it was in the 1920s. So we're basically operating under something that is approximating a feudal system with regard to the distribution of wealth and income. A few things about unions. Countervailing power. This is a very important concept. I want you to grasp the meaning of this concept. John Kenneth Galbraith was an economist who wrote back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. He was probably one of the best known, we would call liberal economists. And he had some critical comments about capitalism, the distribution of income and wealth, and those sorts of things. He said, but things would be a lot worse um, under American capitalism if it wasn't for countervailing power, right? That is, the capitalist class, the corporations don't have all the power. There's countervailing power. There's a source of power that is able to push against them getting everything they want. Otherwise, things would be horrible. What was he referring to when he was talking about countervailing power? He was talking about labor unions. He said labor unions are the countervailing power that prevent the capitalist class from going too far, from grabbing all the riches, from squeezing wages. Well, as you eliminate unions, you eliminate countervailing power, and you obviously at the same time elevate the power of corporations. There's a wage premium. I have this list here. What that means is that if you have unions that are active in representing workers in your state, in your community, in your region, not only will workers who are members of the union make more, okay, that's the wage premium, but you also have a spillover effect. All wages tend to be higher in communities, in regions where unions exist, because when you have workers represented by unions, they make more money, they have better salaries, and other employers have to compete for workers with those organizations, which means they have to raise their wages. So all wages rise as a result of the rising wages for union workers. That's what we call the spillover effect. The one thing you'll read about, which is really, really critical and important, and that is that unions are a source of progressive political mobilization. Union members are educated in politics. They tend to be more progressive. They understand their class interests. They support progressive social and economic policies, and they participate in politics at much higher levels than non-union members. Labor Party, we have no Labor Party in the United States. Okay. We have the Democratic Party, which presumably is supposed to represent workers, but you've done some of the reading and you know what the recent history of that is. And I'll have a little more to say about the party issue. If you go to the slides, I can't do it here because if I try to set this off, it'll take me out of VoiceThread. This is just a little video narration of this relationship that I described if you want to look at it. Okay, it's a very powerful graph. You're reading an article by Western and Rosenfeld, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm just going to say that there's been a lot of empirical analysis done on the relationship between unions and economic equality and economic inequality. One of the studies that they did back in 2011, I think probably one of the first and most statistically rigorous study, showed a very, very powerful effect of unions on reducing inequality, and when the unions were obviously in decline, how that inequality was increasing. And they also talk about a certain kind of ethos, what they call norms of equity, that are generated by labor unions, norms of equity that people begin to appreciate, they develop an attachment to, that translates into the way they see the political system, how they interpret a political conflict, the political parties, etc. Again, norms of equity are generated by labor unions, or labor unions don't exist. You have weak norms of equity, and the United States is the classic case of a major industrialized society where norms of equity are extremely, extremely low relative to Canada, which I'm going to talk about briefly, and obviously Western European countries where you've got 60, 70, 80% represented by labor unions. And this just shows you the relationship at the state level between union membership and income. Obviously, the greater the union membership, the greater the average income in that state. And here we have the states and poverty. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. I'm just trying to show you that there is an enormous amount of empirical work and evidence for the impact of unions on the economic conditions of life. And the one article that you're going to read, and let me just emphasize it's an important article, and I'm asking you just to read the first section because it gets into some more technical quantitative analysis, and then read the conclusion. They talk about all the reasons why there's a relationship between a union density and voter turnout. And this is critical for understanding the current political landscape in the United States, where we have relatively low turnout. And that is due to a variety of factors, the low level of unionization being one, but also the fact that we only have two parties. And there are lots of people that just aren't interested in participating anymore. They don't see a party representing their interest. And they're asked to vote for the lesser of two evils every time, and they're just disgusted. I want to say something about a right to work law because I think there's a lot of confusion about this. And right to work laws exist in different states, and I'm going to show you what states those are. And the Taft-Hartley Act was a legislative act in 1947 that made some changes to the National Labor Relations Act, what was called the Wagner Act, that was instituted after the Great Depression under FDR as a way to allow workers to join unions. It provided the guidelines and the legal protection. And during this period, and this is the beginning of the post-war period, there's a little Cold War, there's an anti-communism element to how people interpret and understand unions. And there was an effort to, the employers wanted to fight back in some way. So they wanted to institute or allow states to legislatively institute a right to work law. And many states did this, particularly southern states. What does a right to work law mean? Because we have one in Florida, and you might have heard reference to this. Do not think it has anything to do with the right to a job. It has nothing to do with that. It is a misnomer. What it means is, they're very clever with the label they give this act, this law, this right to work. It sounds like, well, of course, I'm for the right to work, right? What it means is that at one time, or let's say if you didn't have a right to work law, and you're hired by a company, a business, an enterprise, a corporation that had union representation for workers, when you're hired by that company, you would have to automatically pay dues to the union because the union represents all workers. And there are costs. There are administrative costs. There are costs to promoting and lobbying for their interests on your behalf. They have to sit down and negotiate a collective bargaining agreement. So you automatically pay dues because you have been hired by an organization that has a union that represents your interests. And when they sign a collective bargaining agreement, you benefit from that. It's a collective bargaining agreement. It doesn't just apply to certain people, it applies to all workers. So all workers benefit, all workers pay their dues. The right to work law was put in place that basically said workers could opt out. That is, you could get hired by an organization that had a union that represented you, but you didn't have to pay the dues. It was optional. It was voluntary. Now, this was clearly put in place to weaken the ability of unions to support their workers, to have the resources they needed. And there's a direct correlation between whether there's a right to work law in the state and the percentage of the labor force in a union. Okay. Now, what this means is, and I have the net effects of the right to work law, it means you have free riders. What do I mean by a free rider? You're hired by a company. A union represents you and all the other workers. There's a collective bargaining agreement that ensures that the wages are going up, the benefits are preserved. You benefit from that, but you don't pay dues. Let's say you choose, I'm not going to pay the dues, I don't care. But the union's representing you. They're negotiating a collective bargaining agreement. You benefit from that. But no, I'm not going to pay it. Maybe some other workers will pay it. I'm not going to pay it. That's called free ridership. I sometimes call it free loading, okay, just to be a little more pointed. And I can tell you, you may not know this, faculty at the University of North Florida are represented by a union, United Faculty of Florida. But we're a right to work state. So when someone is employed as a faculty member at the University of North Florida, they are automatically represented by the collective bargaining agreement by virtue of employment, but they don't have to pay dues. And many faculty, I hate to say it, and I give them a hard time, and I don't like it, they don't pay dues. They are free riding, right? Even though they are represented by the collective bargaining agreement. And this is sometimes presented as the freedom. I have the freedom to decide whether I'm going to pay the dues or not. I sometimes like to make the comparison between this sort of right to work idea and a homeowners association, which are everywhere in Florida because you have these subdivisions, right? And these subdivisions, these little neighborhoods, they have a name for the neighborhood. They have a homeowners association. Everyone who owns a home in that subdivision has to pay homeowners association fees, monthly fee or an annual fee. Why? Because they take that money and they invest it in the amenities, the landscaping, ensuring that the neighborhood looks good. What if you said, I want to do the right to work law thing. I don't want to pay the fees. And of course, most people probably don't. It's an expense. You have to. You don't have the choice to opt out, right? I mean, if you gave people the choice to opt out, half the people in the neighborhood would be benefiting from the nice things that were being done by the homeowners association, but they weren't paying. Meanwhile, half the people that are paying, the people that aren't paying would be free riders, right? So for some reason, it's different in a work organization. It doesn't make any sense. I'm totally opposed to the right to work laws. I'm very pro-labor, so that's just the way it is. And so what you have then, again, weak unions in those states that have right to work laws like Florida, and you have lower wages, etc. These are the states that have right to work laws. Number is growing. This was in 2015. I said add West Virginia. That may be contested now, I'm not sure. It's just remarkable to me that we have had, after the great financial crisis of 2007, 2008, which was largely driven by enormous amounts of inequality and years of neoliberal anti-union legislation and corporate action against unions. And then after that, you still have states saying, if we want to, resuscitate our economy, we need to make the business climate favorable. And in order to make the business climate favorable, what do we need to do? We need to make unions weaker, and we need to cut taxes. This is always what they say. Let's cut taxes, and let's make it harder for unions to form. So you have states that passed, typically Republican-dominated legislatures passed right-to-work laws in places that you would never expect. Michigan, the heart of the United Auto Workers, the center of manufacturing in the world, the auto industry, the 1950s and 1960s. Strong union state. Wisconsin, long-standing progressive right to work. they're never satisfied. They never have enough. They want more. And they will continue to push and push and push to make it harder for unions to form. And inequality will grow further unless there's a fundamental restructuring. I'd like to see the Democratic Party say a lot more about unions. Some of you may have heard of the American Legislative Exchange Council. If you haven't, you should definitely do some research on this organization. It's one of the most successful reactionary right-wing policy organizations in the United States. And they realized at one point that the federal government, there's a lot of gridlock at the congressional level in Washington, D.C. We could make probably more progress if we focus on the states. It was a great, from their perspective, from the conservative right-wing perspective, very, very smart move. And that's what they did. They concentrated on the states, and you have, in a majority of states, Republican-dominated governorships and state houses. And let's get those legislators in the states to put in place the kind of policies we want, which we can't get accomplished at the federal level because of the gridlock and the difficulty in implementing these things federally. And so what the American Legislative Exchange Council does is they sit down with corporations and they write legislation. They draft what the legislation would look like. And then there are Republicans in different states that are members of the American Legislative Exchange Council that meet with the corporations, with the ALEC, and they share these pieces of legislation they've written. The corporations literally write the legislation with the American Legislative Exchange Council staff, and they hand these to legislators in different states, including Florida. Okay, we have a number of pieces of legislation in Florida that came directly from ALEC, and the person goes back and introduces that piece of legislation, often word for word, unchanged. And the Republicans in many states, they all pass, because they're the majority, they pass the legislation. Now, this happened in Wisconsin, and it was a little embarrassing. And the governor, of course, supported this, Scott Walker. And the Wisconsin legislature was happy to do this. They literally passed the bill that was word for word drafted by ALEC. And there was one case where they forgot to take the header off that said ALEC on it. This is how sloppy they are. But it doesn't matter. It's shameless. I mean, you talk about democratic process, right? Someone's drafting the laws, handing it to the legislator, takes it back to the state, gets voted on. You play no role, by the way. You, the citizen, no role, none. Right to work is coming to the public sector. That was the Janus case that went to the Supreme Court, and they voted in favor of Janus, public sector worker that did not want to pay dues. So now you have public sector unions generally, regardless of whether it's a right to work state, having a more difficult time collecting dues because the right to work concept is now applied across the board to public sector unions. And that's what this is all about. You can learn more about this. This was the case Janus versus the, American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSCME. That's a fairly powerful union. All right. How do right to work states fare? I think what I'm going to do, because this ends automatically at 50 minutes, I'm going to stop. I'm sorry, it stops automatically at 60 minutes. I'm going to stop at this point and come back and then do about 10 or 15 more minutes. This way we won't get interrupted abruptly. This is a good transition point.